The Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and the looming threat of war dominated the headlines across the world during the 1930s. But how was life for Londoners during this turbulent time? Welcome to our channel. And today, let's find out what London was like in the 1930s. During the 1930s, London was a city of poverty and hardship. The Great Depression, which started with the Wall Street crash of 1929, lasted throughout most of the decade and hit London hard. Unemployment reached over 2 million by 1932, with almost a quarter of the city's workforce out of a job. Whole families were affected, and the numbers of homeless people grew rapidly. People who had lost their jobs and their homes slept rough on the streets or in the parks. The worst hit were unskilled workers, such as laborers, servants, and dock workers. By 1933, 60% of Londoners were living below the poverty line, and food prices had risen by 70% since 1914. Many families struggled to afford basic necessities and relied on cheap filling stations to feed their children. Children were also working to help their families survive. By 1933, there were an estimated 250,000 child workers in London alone. They worked long hours in factories and workshops for very little money. It is also estimated that around 200,000 children regularly stole food to survive. It was better if they were caught stealing than being beaten at home for not bringing food back. If caught, they would receive a small fine or be sent to a reform school, which was often better than their life on the streets. In the countryside, farmers also suffered during the Depression. Farmland was being taken out of production because it was unprofitable to grow crops when food prices were falling. This led to rural unemployment, and people had to move into London in search of work, putting even more strain on the city's resources. After the First World War, many people hoped for a peaceful period of recovery and rebuilding, but instead, the 1930s were dominated by aggressive nationalism and the threat of another devastating conflict. The Spanish Civil War, which began in 1936, was seen as a precursor to a wider European war. Many British volunteers went to Spain to fight against the fascists. Some of them returned to Britain with disturbing stories of the atrocities committed by fascist forces, including the bombing of civilian areas. These stories increased fears of fascism in Britain. In 1938, Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister and pursued a policy of appeasement towards Germany. He believed that if he gave Hitler what he wanted, war could be avoided. But appeasement only encouraged Hitler to be more aggressive. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. People rushed to buy food and supplies. Shelves were emptied in a matter of hours, and panic buying became widespread. There were even rumors of a German invasion of Britain, although no one anticipated that fighting would take place on the streets of London. The threat of air raids meant that people had to be prepared for the possibility of being bombed. But the Blitz did not begin until a year later. In the summer of 1940, the Germans began dropping bombs on London, causing extensive damage and loss of life. At first, Londoners tried to carry on with their lives as normal, but as the bombing continued, people had to take cover in the tube stations or the deep shelters built in the 1920s. During the worst periods of the Blitz, people spent more than a week in these shelters with little food and water. Men, women, and children slept on the floor among the debris. Life during the Blitz was dangerous, dirty, and exhausting. The constant fear of death hung over the people of London. Homes were destroyed, people were killed, and entire communities were displaced. The bomb sites became a feature of the London landscape. Many people have romanticized the Blitz, but it was really a traumatic experience that left a lasting impact on the people of London. It might seem surprising that in the middle of a world war, people found the time and energy to dance. But dancing was an important part of Londoners' lives. During the Second World War, it was a way to escape the hardships of war and the constant threat of death. Dancing also helped to boost morale and keep people's spirits up. The most popular dances during the war were the jitterbug, the Lindy Hop, and the Charleston. These dances were fast and energetic, and they allowed people to let off some steam. Dancing was also a way for people to meet new friends and socialize. The ballrooms and dance halls were full of people from all walks of life. The war had brought people together, and they danced cheek to cheek regardless of their social status. London transport was revolutionary in the 1930s. The first London Underground map was published in 1931, and it is still in use today. The iconic design was the brainchild of Harry Beck, a draftsman who was inspired by the city's sewer system. When he presented his idea to the London Underground Railway Company, it was initially rejected as too confusing. However, the map was eventually adopted, and it has become one of the most famous symbols of London. The London Underground was also extended in the 1930s to cover more of the city. This made it easier for people to get around, and it also provided employment opportunities for thousands of people. The new tube lines were built using the cut-and-cover method, which involved digging a trench and then covering it over. This made it possible to build new stations and tunnels without disrupting the surface traffic. As London changed during the 1930s, so did the roles and responsibilities of the police. In the past, the police had been responsible for maintaining order and preventing crime. However, in the 1930s, the police also had to deal with the threat of terrorism and civil unrest. With the rise of fascism and the growing tensions in Europe, there was a real fear that London could be targeted by terrorists. The police were given new powers to stop and search people and to raid buildings without a warrant. They were also given new equipment, including helmets and shields. In addition to dealing with the threat of terrorism, the police also had to deal with civil unrest. There were several major strikes during the 1930s, and the police were called in to keep the peace. They were also responsible for dealing with the growing number of unemployed people who were living in poverty. The police were often called in to break up gangs of young people who were fighting in the streets. They were also responsible for dealing with the homeless people who were sleeping rough on the streets. The 1930s was a time of great change for the Metropolitan Police Service. They had to deal with the threat of war, terrorism, and civil unrest. They were given new powers, equipment, and responsibilities. They played an important role in keeping London safe during a time of great upheaval. By the end of the 1930s, the world had changed dramatically. London was no longer the great metropolis it had been before the war. It was a city that was divided, a city that was scarred by war, and a city that was full of uncertainty about the future. But despite all of this, London was still a city that was full of hope. The people of London were proud of their city, and they were determined to rebuild it and make it even greater than before. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.